Welcome to all of you to the ROCS lecture series kickoff lecture, Ocean Biology and Climate with Professor Katherine Richardson. But she is going to explore with us why ocean biology matters for climate concerns and outline the questions being addressed in ROCS. So on a planet where human relationships to nature are impactful and nature is responding in ways that have great significance for humans, and where all of this is happening at unprecedented speed, shaping complex and dynamic human and non-human entanglements, there is an escalating call for investigations and research that venture beyond the dichotomous boundaries of nature, culture, and society. So, supported by the Carlsberg Foundation, the Icelandic state and Rannis, Queen Margaretes and Vigdís Finnbogadóttir's interdisciplinary research center on ocean, climate, and society, or ROCS, like we want to call it for short, unites researchers and merges research interests across discipline exactly to this end. So the center is led by Professor Katherine Richardson, whom we have the pleasure of having with us today. She is a professor of biological oceanography at Globe Institute and former chairman of the Danish Climate Commission, as well as lots of other things. And as well as leading ROCS, she also leads the Sustainability Science Center at the University of Copenhagen. So again, a warm welcome to Professor Richardson and all of you. Just a gentle reminder that this session or this event is being recorded. And Professor Richardson, I will give the floor to you now.
Thank you very much, Anders. And I'd also like to thank you for having gotten all this going. My dream is that this center can be a meeting place for not only people who are directly receiving funding from it or are working directly in it, but people who are doing things that are related and would like to interact. So I have a dream for these meetings as well, and I do hope it's delightful to see 20 people here, and I do hope they will be able to live on. I would like to start by saying I can't make this go. I knew that was going to happen. I answered something in the chat, and when you do that, I have to stop sharing and start all over again. Sorry. I think there's a quirk in Zoom that if you wiggle anything, then it's not going to work anymore. Okay, I'd like to start here because I think that this picture, which came in connection with the Apollo mission in the late 60s and the beginning of the 70s, I think really started us all, every person on Earth, on a journey in which we're changing our understanding of our relationship to the rest of the planet. And I know you've seen this picture because I've been told it's the picture that's most downloaded from the net. But there's two things about it that you've never really stopped to think about and worry about. The first, of course, is that our ancestors made a terrible, terrible mistake when they called this planet Earth. It should be called ocean. 2/3 of the planet is covered by ocean. The other, of course, is that there's no umbilical cord. And of course, there's no umbilical cord. But what does that mean that there isn't an umbilical cord? What it means is that once we've used the Earth's resources, and make no mistake, it's not money that makes us rich. No one can eat money or put money on to stay warm or live in money. It's the Earth's resources that actually make us rich. And once we've used them, we're not going to get any more. So I think the recognition of looking at this picture it makes us all realize the fact that we can't really get rid of our waste because there's no pipe leading things away. I mean, we talk about plastic in the ocean, but we've been throwing out plastic since the 1950s, knowing that it was basically non-degradable in nature. And we've had this picture since the 1972, this particular picture. And, clearly the plastic has no place to go, and 2/3 of the Earth is covered in ocean. So this isn't rocket science. Where did we think the plastic was going to go? Of course, it's in the ocean. So it's this understanding of the Earth as being a sort of, it's not a closed system because it gets energy from outside, but an almost closed system is causing us to think about our relationship to it, and in fact, how the Earth itself works. And what's really unique about this planet is the fact that there's life. And, you know, we go around and we talk about climate all the time, but climate is not, I mean, having a climate is really nothing very special. Every planet has a climate, and every planet has elements and molecules that are left over from the Big Bang. But on these other planets, the elements and molecules don't like to interact very much with each other. They do interact, but slowly. We say they're basically inert. They don't react very readily. But on land, we have life. And what does life do? It transforms and it transports these elements. So it's the interaction between life and climate, or the energy budget that the Earth has, that actually defines the characteristics or the conditions that you have on Earth at any given time. And we go around, physicists at least have a picture in their mind of biology writing on the back of physics, but it's not like that. It's the interaction between biology and physics, or the energy budget that we have on the planet, that actually decides the conditions on Earth. And this picture here has also started a whole new scientific domain. Arnda's worked very hard in coughing her way through biological oceanographer when she introduced me. And it's true, I'm trained as a biological oceanographer, but I've used the last 30 years trying with a lot of other people to develop a new scientific domain called Earth System Science, which is about how the Earth operates or behaves as a system. And in 2001, we came with a declaration saying the Earth system behaves as this system, where it's the physics, chemistry, people, and biological components together that decide the future, or the state of the Earth, as it were. And I put a reference in here to a paper that we wrote last year about the evolution of Earth system science. But I consider myself much more an Earth system scientist today than I do a biological oceanographer. And every poor person that introduces me coughs their way through biological oceanographer, only to have me say, but I'm not one really anymore. So these components, the physics, the chemistry, the humans, and the biology, have co-evolved, and it's the interactions between them that are really important. But we're not very good at universities at looking at interactions. We have our own disciplinary boxes, and we have it, you know, if we get all the details right in our little box, if we could take those details and pump them into a big pot together with everybody else's details, we'd understand the Earth. But we won't, because we don't understand the interactions. Now, some of these interactions between these four components we're used to looking at. There's the geophysics to biology. What's the effect of climate on nature? We also look at the effect of the physics, or the climate, the temperature, or whatever, on chemical processes. We're used to doing that. And we look at chemistry's effect on biology. What happens when we acidify the ocean, or change the CO2 concentration, and so on. We also look at how biology changes chemistry. We look at oxygen depletion, and so on. But what we're trying to do in ROCS is turn the focus a couple of other places. We are looking, we also look at people's influence on climate, and we look at people's influence on biology. But we don't very much look at this interaction between biology and the climate, or biology and the people. It's always going the other way. And in fact, we have a very difficult time when it comes to trying to quantify this relationship between physics and biology. And that's actually because most of our focus in biology has been on individual organisms. and not on what they do together, the role of the biosphere. The biosphere is all living organisms, the role of the biosphere in this system that we have here. And a couple of months ago, when we had our cruise, Angela Rawlings, one of the postdocs on the cruise, was performing a poem that she had written. And I honestly can't tell you what that poem was about, but it has really stuck with me. And I've written an article or an essay that's coming in the newspaper Information next month on this experience. Because what Angela had done was she had written this poem where she started out using all the letters of the alphabet. And as she proceeded into the poem, she started taking letters away and could only choose words that had remaining letters that were there. And of course, in the beginning, it was still very understandable. It wasn't quite as flowery a language, but it was still very understandable. And as you got farther and farther into the poem, it became harder and harder to understand. And in the end, there was nothing but grunts and noises left. And then Angela said, and these are species. You can take away some species and the system still seems to be functioning, but there must come a point when the system won't function properly, or the communication isn't there anymore. And our problem is we don't really understand the language that is spoken when all of the species come together. And this newspaper that asked me to do the essay asked me to identify the scientific question that I would most like to see answered. And it's this one: what is the role of the biosphere in the Earth system? How does it function? That's not to say that, worrying about conservation in individual species is not important, but I think this next level of understanding what the biosphere together does is incredibly important. Anyway, at ROCS, we're trying to look at how physics, geophysics, climate influences biology, how biology influences climate, and how changes in biology influence the people who are using them. Why do we think that especially ocean biology can influence climate? Well, to understand why we're so why we suspect that this can be the case, you have to recognize that the Earth's climate has varied a lot through time. Here in the blue lines, you see temperature. This is 425,000 years ago. And this is warm and cold and warm and cold and warm and cold. And you can see that these are ice ages coming and going. So the blue line is showing you temperature. The orange dots are showing you CO2 concentration. And these are taken from some ice cores in the Antarctic. And why do we have this variation in both temperature and in CO2? Well, there are lots of different reasons, and part of it is the position of the Earth and its relation, the angle that it has to the sun and the kind of its orbit that it has. But there are also feedback cycles in this. It can be the ice albedo feedbacks that, when ice is on the ocean in the Arctic, when the heat from the sun comes, it gets sent back to space in wavelengths that don't get absorbed by greenhouse gases, so it doesn't play a role in warming the ocean. But if you take the ice away, then the heat stays in the water and warms the Earth. That's not what I worry about, but there are also greenhouse gas feedbacks. And what you can see here is that the difference between, as you go from an ice age to a non-ice age, the difference in the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is about 80 parts per million. 80 parts per million. Where can you in the Earth system actually account for taking 80 parts per million out of the atmosphere or putting it in? And it turns out that the ocean is the only place where you have that kind of CO2 just sitting around waiting to move about between the atmosphere and the ocean. And in fact, we think that a part of the explanation, and some people think it's large, some people think it's not that large, but we need to quantify it. a contribution to that change of 80 parts per million is believed to lie with these tiny little plants in the ocean. They are all so small that you cannot see them with the naked eye. And yet they are more different from each other than all of the plants we have on land. Sort of popularly speaking, we can say at one point in life in the history of Earth, an ocean plant decided to come up on land, and all of the plants that we have now are cousins of the one that first came. Whereas these tiny little plants started many different places, evolutionarily speaking. They started because one-celled animals took up some bacteria that had learned to do photosynthesis, and at first they just probably lived together and enjoyed each other's, but in the end they became new organisms, where you have this photosynthesis, this photosynthesizing organism becomes central to the plant itself, and so you have these plants in the ocean are very, very different from one another. We don't recognize that because they're so small. But even that question of being so small depends on the eye who's looking at it, because the relative size difference between the largest and the smallest of these, if you look at it in terms of volume, the largest, you can see some here, this is a Coskin discus. The smallest ones, this is a diatom. The smallest ones are, you can't even really see them here. They're just little specks because they're the size of large bacteria. And the relative size difference between the largest and the smallest of these guys is greater than the relative volume difference between a mouse and an elephant. And even if you're not a natural scientist, you have to realize that mice and elephants go into the food web differently from one another. And it's the same is true here. It makes a difference who's here for who's going to eat you. But it turns out it probably also makes a difference in terms of climate. I'm really quite fascinated by these little guys here. And I often in my teaching over the past many years, I've said that I'm a little bit, I always feel a bit guilty when I go in to buy sheets or material for clothes, because the interior designers have done designs that really, if you look, you can find them in nature. So nature got there first. If you can see these guys right up close, there's a fantastic, intricate design on them. And so I've been saying that, really, we should be using them on material. And look what I found this summer. I found some material for in my summer house. This is a curtain I made for the back door of our summer house, covered in diatoms. So now we are actually seeing that interior designers aren't even bothering to pretend they're doing it on their own anymore. They're using pictures or they're using nature itself to do their designs. Now, to understand why these phytoplankton should be so important, these little plants should be so important in climate, it's important to look at the global carbon cycle. Now, this looks terribly complicated and it is old, but the idea is still very good, and I think it's very pedagogical. If you look at the white numbers here, these are what we call stocks. That's something that's just sitting there. If you're looking at the little arrows, they're flows that we have here. So we're moving carbon from the ocean to the atmosphere, we're bringing it down, and so on. And if you look at all the carbon, all the white numbers over here in the ocean, you realize there's about 50 times or more than 50 times more CO2 in the ocean, or more carbon in the ocean, much of it is CO2, in the ocean as there is in the atmosphere. And the ocean is in contact with the atmosphere over 2/3 of the planet, and it exchanges here. So what happens here, you will never understand what's going to happen to CO2 in the atmosphere if you don't understand what's happening to carbon in the ocean. Forget about the sediments in the ocean, which is the greatest reservoir we have of carbon anywhere on this planet. But just in the water itself, there's over 50 times more carbon than there is in the atmosphere. The other thing that's really interesting about this is if you look at the plants, or look at the living organisms, the biosphere, the living organisms on land, they actually store about 550 gigatons of carbon, and most of it's in plants. If you go to the ocean, there's only about 3 gigatons in living organisms. So there's a very small amount that's actually caught up in the plants themselves. Now, what this means is that on land, you can use photosynthesis, the whole, the plant activity where they take CO2 out of the atmosphere and make sugars and all the stuff we learned in 4th grade chemistry. You can actually use photosynthesis as a good proxy for how much carbon is biology storing on land. But you just can't do that in the ocean because the carbon that's being fixed isn't staying in biological organisms. We think there's just about as much photosynthesis going on in the ocean as there is going on land, but it's not staying in the organisms themselves. So then we have to ask ourselves, how is it then that the carbon that these little tiny plants are taking up, if it doesn't get stuck in them or fish or whatever, where is it? How can we talk about biology playing a role in terms of capturing, sequestering, storing carbon in the ocean? And here we have to look, there's several things we have to look at. One, you have these little plants up here in the surface layer, and they are doing photosynthesis. Most of them are dying, being respired, being eaten, whatever, up here in this layer. So you produce CO2 and then it comes out again. So you go CO2 coming in, coming out. So the carbon's only there for a very short visit. So that's not really very interesting. What is interesting is that some portion of this that gets fixed into organic material sinks into the very deep ocean. And this dotted line here means that this isn't mixing up anymore. This is the very deep ocean that's staying down there. So if you get something down there, it's not going to be in contact with the atmosphere. And even if bacteria break it down and make CO2 out of it, it isn't going to come out to the atmosphere because it's got this layer, this surface layer of the ocean on it. So it's this arrow, it's this amount that comes down here, which is really important. And we call this the biological pump, which is a lousy name because pump makes it sound like it's active and it happens on its own. But in fact, this is all passive. It just sinks. But the plants or whatever ate them that die and sink down to the bottom, that is what is the biological pump. Now, the strength of this biological pump varies in both time and space, and we don't understand very well the processes that make it change. But one of the reasons is biodiversity, because it matters who's there. I told you there was a big difference in the size range of these tiny little plants. When you have really big plants like this, or phytoplankton like this, they can be directly eaten by the large zooplankton, which are then eaten by small fish. So you have, wow, we catch the sun's energy here. We have one link up to a trophic level and one more here until we get to fish, and then one more to us. So you only have 3, maybe 4 trophic levels that you go through before the sun's energy actually gets up to us. And the number of trophic levels is really important because every time you move from one trophic level to another, you actually lose about 90% of the energy. If, on the other hand, you start with very small organisms here, the big ones can't eat them. So they can get eaten by something smaller, which then gets eaten by something a little bigger, which then can be eaten by the large zooplankton. So you've added at least 2 more, and if you take this circle here, 3 more levels in the trophic level. And again, you lose 90% of the energy every time you move. So when you have small phytoplankton, we don't expect there to be, for example, very many fish because you won't get all that energy up to the top. And it's not only a question of food webs, because large phytoplankton sink more readily than small phytoplankton. So if we want to get them down to the bottom of the ocean, size really matters. So size is important, both with respect to the food webs, how many fish you have around, but also with respect to how much carbon can ride via the biological pump to the bottom of the ocean. Now, from some earlier work that I've done, this was the Galathea expedition that we had from 2006 to 2007, where we went around the world, which gave me a good opportunity to look at the relationship. Here is looking at the relationship between the size of phytoplankton and temperature. And what I've done here is I don't go in and count them all and look at them all. It's all too complicated. I simply take, here's a filter, and the holes on it, the pores in it are 10 microns. And I look at how much of the plant material gets stuck on that pore. If there's a lot of it, then I'm up here. I have big phytoplankton that can't get through. If there isn't very much, then I have small organisms. And you can see there's a very clear relationship between, this is -2 to 6 degrees, this is 6 to 14 degrees, 14 to 22, 22 to 30. And you can see that the warmer the water is, the smaller the phytoplankton are. And this is partly a question of nutrient availability, but we showed in our analyses, especially this Mousing et al. 2015, there is a direct temperature effect on these phytoplankton. The other thing we looked at was sea-air exchange, the amount of CO2 coming into the ocean. Or actually, this is the amount coming into the ocean from the atmosphere. And this is, again, the size. Here we have the size. You have big cells up here, small cells down here. And you can see the bigger the cells, the bigger the flux of CO2 from the atmosphere to the ocean, the big cells, big amount of carbon coming into the ocean. Small cells, small amount of carbon coming into the ocean. So we think that the size of the structure of the phytoplankton ecosystems is important for moving carbon between the ocean and the atmosphere. So our hypothesis is then in a warmer ocean, we will have smaller phytoplankton, a weaker biological pump, and we'll have less CO2 taken up from the atmosphere to the ocean via biological processes. Now that's the way it looks when we look at the ocean today. But what we'd really like to do is show this hypothesized link between climate and plankton ecosystem structure throughout the history, not just now and the small climate changes that we're seeing today, but what did it look like in the past when we had climate changes? Can we relate changes in the ecosystem structure of phytoplankton in the ocean to climate events? And now we think, or no, now we have the tool to be able to do so. And that's eDNA, environmental DNA, which is really very simple. We go out to nature and we collect some samples and we bring them into the lab and we examine them to see what genes are there. And then we can recreate what the nature, what the ecosystems look like at the time that our soil or whatever was formed. And so what we want to do is to use this process on ocean sediments and go in and try and be able to identify differences in the structure of the ecosystems, the plant ecosystems in the ocean in relation to climate. And here I'd like to show you, to explain a little. I hope you're going to get the Are you seeing this? No?
Nope, nope.
No.
I was afraid of that. Just a sec.
What's happening in the ocean, how it impacts what happens on land, and how people respond to that.
And what we're looking
How to
at
do this.
is, first of all, climate, because climate has an enormous impact on the ocean, and it changes the nature in the ocean. And when it does that, it also
You seeing
changes the
anything now?
ecosystem services available for people on land. We have a hypothesis, a general hypothesis, it's not only our own, but there's this general idea that changes in ocean nature, in the plankton in the ocean, and how much photosynthesis the plankton actually could carry out was influenced by climate, but it in return also influenced climate. So we haven't, until now, we haven't had the possibility to go in and look at how nature and climate have changed together through historical time. What we do in the ROCS Center is that we take sediment cores from the ocean that we can analyze for DNA. And when we do that, we can describe the ecosystems or how nature worked under different climate conditions. But it's not only about looking at what happens at the ocean, because here you have Iceland in the middle of the North Atlantic, and clearly the climate that they're enjoying or not in Iceland is a product of what the ocean is bringing to them. So there's a clear interaction between the ocean and Iceland and the nature on Iceland, and we want to understand that. So we also take sediment cores from lakes, and from those sediment cores we can also analyze the DNA and in that way describe nature and how nature in Iceland changed with respect to changing climate. For the last 800 years or so, there have also been people in Iceland. So we can also study how the changes that occurred in the nature and the climate in Iceland influenced the people in Iceland. And actually, we can also look at how the presence of people changed the nature in Iceland. So we're looking a lot at interactions between ocean and life, the possibilities for life, both for nature and for people in Iceland, and how the people in Iceland influence nature, and how nature in the ocean may have impacted climate. Iceland is an absolutely perfect place to do this kind of work. It's sort of a natural laboratory because there's really very little that can influence the climate conditions, no huge mountain ranges in the middle or whatever that can influence the climate. The climate is very much controlled by the signals it's getting from the ocean. And once you get people in Iceland, they really have to stay there, at least until recent times. So they didn't have the possibility to migrate away from some of the changes that they were seeing. They had to adapt. So this is a perfect place to do this kind of a study that I consider to be a real Earth system science study, because we're looking at interactions between ocean and land, interactions between nature and people, interactions between people and nature, and interactions between nature and climate.
And let's see if I can get this back in. So that was a sort of an introduction to the project itself. Where are we now? Here we have a schematic of what we're doing in the ocean, and we're trying to get our sediment cores and so on. We also want to, I'll show you, there's three things that we're doing. So here's, we've got ocean, and we've got lakes, and then we've got the historical sources that we're looking at, and then we're looking at these relationships that there are as well. There are three main themes in ROCS. One is this analysis of ocean and lake sediment cores. DNA. We got, as you saw in the film, we got cores from lakes in 2020, and this spring or in June we had a fantastic cruise that some of you were on Arne Frederiksen, which I actually think is the best ship I've ever worked on, and we got some fantastic cores. The lake cores have already had their DNA extracted. It's being analyzed at the moment. The ocean cores, we've started opening them and extracting DNA, and we're in the process of trying to hire some bioinformatics people that can help us do the analyses. So that part's going really well. The next leg that we have here is understanding the climate nature responses in today's ocean. So trying to map whether we can see these sorts of relationships in the plankton that I was talking about, in ecosystem structure, and also how does it impact the amount of material falling down, and what is the material falling down. I'd also very much like to be able to bring this farther up in the food web and look at fish and climate relationships and so on. And then the final is looking at the people, climate, nature interactions, where we have got 3 postdocs, including Anders, who are all working in this domain. And you will be, in later talks, you will be hearing about what they are all doing. So I feel that in spite of COVID, we got off to a flying start. And where we really need to focus now is getting our studies on the Anthropocene ocean. And there I hope to be able to piggyback. There's still some money left in the project to use the Icelandic ships. And I'd like to work together with people in Iceland to try and look at some of these climate nature interactions in the ocean, in today's ocean. So that I need to be revving up. And to be perfectly honest, if I could find somebody who could collaborate on the archaeology side, I think that would be a really interesting way to develop this program as well. So that was about rocks, but I was supposed to be talking about ocean climate and biology, or ocean biology and climate. And so I've tried to put together a take-home message here. And my take-home message is that today climate models treat phytoplankton as a black box, and they don't yet capture the interaction between climate and plankton diversity or biodiversity and the processes that are there. Now, all of us know that you've got a different flow of carbon in a rainforest than in a desert or in a patch of nettles. And yet we go around and expect phytoplankton to all do the same thing. And I promise you, they don't. Right now, the climate models have all of their focus on photosynthesis, or primary production. And as I said before, photosynthesis is a very good proxy for the removal of carbon and putting it into storage when you're on land, the biological removal and storage of carbon when you're on land. But it doesn't really work in the ocean. What we need in the ocean is to be able to quantify the strength of the biological pump. What we're trying to do in ROCS is to open the black box and to put ocean into which climate modelers tend to put ocean biology in order to be able to better constrain the biological pump. And of course, in the end of the day, it's all about being able to better predict future Earth conditions. Thank you.